What I hope to accomplish today is to give you a taste of Dr. Feldenkrais's work and his ideas, a kind of basic grounding in the theory and the practice, and to give you a direct experience of it so that you can understand how effective it is and how change or improvement that one might think would need to take weeks or months, or you have to work and stretch, can actually just take minutes when we understand how the brain can be used on our behalf, how your brain can be used on your behalf. So I first met Dr. Feldenkrais in 1973. So that's a while ago for some of you. And I was a pre-med student at the University of California, Berkeley, and I had been told about him. He came to Berkeley to teach for 5 weeks, and I kind of pushed my way in, maybe the second of the 5 weeks that he was there. And I was interested in what he was saying to the extent that I could understand it, but I was on my track. And during the time that he was there at Berkeley in that month, he was giving treatments, what we call functional integration, which is a hands-on aspect of the work. He was working with a fellow from Washington, D.C., who was very severely disabled, maybe in his mid-30s, very sweet guy, very intelligent. He was actually a congressional page. And he had, as I said, he had cerebral palsy, but his whole self was involved, affected. You have a very difficult time understanding his speech. He had a difficult time walking. Anything that he did was very labored. And over the period of that month that I was there, he worked with this fellow, he or an assistant of Dr. Feldenkrais, they worked with this guy every day for about 45 minutes or an hour. And by the 5th week, the change was so shocking. And again, I would consider myself to be kind of a naive person in the sense of that I had never really encountered cerebral palsy. I don't know how to evaluate, is it better, is it not better? But it's a kind of difference that you would be able to see. It was the difference between being able to understand him and not understand him. It was the difference between him being able to move easily, comfortably, and not being able to move easily and comfortably. And I don't know how you would feel, but I was shocked by this because certainly he came. He was not a child. He came as I said, in his mid-30s. In other words, a formed person with 35 years of knowing himself in this way, right? Organizing himself to move and encounter the world through this spasticity, right? Through this difficulty but yet over a period of 4 weeks, the change was so dramatic. And from I don't know if you've had things like this in your life, but at that moment, I understood that I was going to take a detour for a while, that I needed to understand what it was that he was doing, what it was that Dr. Feldenkrais was doing that could have this kind of effect. Feldenkrais was a scientist. Not like he was doing some hocus pocus. It's not like he was, it was a laying on of hands. He was a scientist and communicated that what he was doing, others could do. It was predictable and it was methodical. Not methodical in a procedural sense, but methodical in terms of the thinking behind what he was doing. So from that, I left a number of months later after I graduated. I left for Israel, and I studied directly with him until he passed away in 1984. Yeah, 1984, he passed away. So I studied with him for about 11 years, and today I have to tell you that today the work continues to hold my interest and fascinate me just as much now as it did then, which is pretty wild, you know. Some people are really lucky, like musicians or painters, right, or actors, where they say, "This is my passion," and this is their life path for their entire life. It's one beautiful, you know, engaged, involved arc. I mean, not just actors and painters and musicians, but to have something that attracted me like that, and then to be able to help people, as he was doing, to be able to help people in that way. You know, it's been a good thing for me. So a little bit about Dr. Feldenkrais, and he, as I said, he was a scientist. He was a physicist, and but at a certain point, he was a very highly regarded physicist. He worked at the Curie lab in Paris. You know, Madame Curie, Joliot Curie, these people who all won Nobel Prizes. And he worked directly with Joliot Curie. They published a lot of papers together. And but he had other interests, and one of them was sports. He liked sports. And he injured himself quite severely, and then later was hit by a car and found himself working in England during the Second World War. He found himself unable to walk, literally, or he could walk with great difficulty. But so he'd go from wheelchair to walking with difficulty, and so he decided to apply his thinking, his ability to figure this out, thinking as a scientist does, that a problem has a source, and if he could figure out the problem, maybe he could help himself to walk again. And he came in this process, which lasted a number of years, a good 10 years, he came up with some very, I think, at that moment anyway, radical ideas. So one that was pivotal for him was that how we move is learned. In other words, this differentiates us in a very radical way from all the other sentient beings, all the other animals that move. They are born fundamentally, not exactly the same, but fundamentally you could say that they are born wired in with the ability already to do the functions they need to do as a mature animal. A horse, a foal that's born, within a very short period of time, that foal is standing and walking. I understand it's in a shaky way, so obviously there is some kind of learning going on, because it's in gravity rather than in a environment more or less absent of gravity during gestation. But it's already wired in at birth. What happens with us is we're born prematurely. Right? we are born much earlier than relative to development than all the other animals, all the other mammals. Now, you could talk about marsupials, but let's set that aside for the moment. So, because marsupials, right, they have the period that then but they're still completely undeveloped when they're in the pouch. So what does that mean? It means that moving, being in gravity, being in the environment, is something that we have to learn. It's something that we have to learn. There isn't a program for walking. There isn't a program for standing. And so there has to be this long apprenticeship, which lasts how long? Lasts for some kids 10 months, for other kids 14 months, right? In other words, there's a long apprenticeship period before an infant can even stand and begin to walk. We don't even call it walking. We say she's a toddler, right? So, a teetotaling toddler. Now, this is very important. It means that all of our functions are learned, right? And so that learning is influenced by my parents, my culture, by the psychological, emotional things that are going on in that environment. Now, of course, we all come up with the same basic solution, which is walking. Why do we all come up with that? So why don't half of us crawl and half of us, do somersaults and half of us walk, or half of us, a third of us, whatever. Because walking is our common solution. Because, well, firstly, we're seeing other people walk, but it's also that it's the least energy expending way of moving. Okay? Now, the reason I mention the records we have of feral children, right? Children who are parentless and born in the wild. We have records of some. They don't walk. They don't walk because they don't see the walking. They see the other animals, right? The dogs, the wolves, whatever. They see them only on all fours. So that makes it clear there is not some kind of enneagram or program lying there in the brain for walking. Okay? You had to figure out how to do it. So with Feldenkrais, his problem was his knees. And he said, well, if I can figure out how it is that the brain learns to walk, right? How is it that we learn to walk? Maybe I can help myself. Maybe there was something faulty, not in his knees, but in the way that he learned, right? The way that he used himself. So this is a really interesting departure because the accent is not on, if you would just stretch your muscles, right? If you would just, the problem is that your back muscles aren't strong enough. Right? Or the problem is that you just need to, tie weights to your legs and strengthen the ligaments of your knees. Right? The truth is, his ligaments were completely shot, and you could take his kneecap and move it literally up to here. Right? So, in other words, he's bypassing. We are putting the accent in a completely unique place compared to any other way of thinking. And we're not saying the problem is the muscles, right? Or your energy, or your meridians, or your spiritual issues, right? But is spine. But in fact, it has to do with how you're organized to move. Okay, now, the next thing that he figured out, which you'll see in a moment how it works, is so what are the conditions by which the brain learned that way? Right? What are the conditions that enable learning? Okay? And once he understood that, you'll see that change, improvement, whatever you want to call it, can happen, as I said, almost immediately. Almost immediately, you can feel a difference in how you were a half an hour ago doing something, and then how you're doing it after what we call a lesson. He wanted to distinguish what he was doing from exercise by having the accent on this notion that the brain can learn and always learn. And this now, many years later, you've probably heard this concept about plasticity of the brain. You heard that? So the plasticity means it's a very, very, very new assumption in science, very new, that everyone's brain is capable of learning over our entire lifespan. Okay? Now, that's very different. In the 1980s, right, into maybe the early 90s, the dominant thinking was that your brain is sloughing off neurons at an astounding rate, actually, of 10,000 neurons a day are just kind of perishing, being sloughed off. And so that's how you explain the difficulties of older people, to learn. Right? So it takes more time for an adult to learn something, or they beg off learning. Okay, this is the way I am. But now we know that those 10,000 neurons are not sloughing off at all, and that your brain was created with the capacity to learn, to change, to make new connections, form new patterns for your entire life. Right? So what happens is we grow up in our particular environment, and we say, all right, this is who I am. Right? This is who I am. I feel myself, I can do certain things. There's other things that I can't do. Right? There's certain things I'm good at, but I can't do math. Right? Or I'm good at this, but I'm terrible at relationships. Or I'm fearful, I'm anxious. And we think that is my identity. That's my self-image. And we don't realize that those feelings and that image of myself, that self-image I carry around with myself, is an accident. I'm not saying it's not real. I'm saying it's an accident of the randomness of how I learned as a child. And by randomness, I mean I didn't control it. None of us grew up in an ideal family, right? Or somehow where parents understood this is, if we don't interfere, development will happen in an organic way, or loving Junior even in spite, and inhibiting in themselves the desire to punish or whatever it is. But we grow up and we think, oh, right, this is me. I can do certain things, I can't do certain things, and we realize that feeling of can do or can't do is simply an artifact of this formed self-image, accidental self-image. Right? So you'll see in just the next hour, next 45 minutes, you'll see that this way of feeling myself is something that's entirely malleable. You just need to understand how it is that our brain learns. And then it learns almost, as I said, immediately.
I can follow what you're saying up until the point where you talk about the immediacy of the effect. I don't understand how it happens right away.
You can't. You can't understand. Because that's why I said that I was going to introduce you to the basic ideas and give you a direct experience. So I haven't given you the direct experience yet.
Okay, great.
It's completely
Can't
abstract.
wait.
We're going to do, as I said, what Dr. Feldenkrais called a lesson. There's two kinds of lessons. There's group lessons, also called awareness through movement, and then there's individual. Okay? I'll try today and show you an example of the individual work, but right now we're going to experience on ourselves how awareness through movement works. All right? So I will be giving you the instructions. We're going to do something that's should be relatively easy for each of you. And if you're having any discomfort, you wave your arm and one of us will come help you. I would ask you to be skeptical. Now, some of you have already done awareness through movement, and so you have a little familiarity. But for the others of you, I would say to have your best skeptical hat on. In other words, so that you don't walk away from here thinking that he hypnotized me, he induced in me the idea that something is different. It's not really different. I'm just believing it's different. Okay? So if you're skeptical and you feel the difference, then you know that the difference is attributable to what we've been doing, right? Because there's nothing in the air here, right? There's nothing in the water, I promise. Okay. So to that end, we begin any awareness through movement lesson by sensing and feeling ourselves in a basic, simple way. And that is, we're going to sense just how we're lying on the floor. So that, and I'll guide you, so that as we progress, you'll be able to detect whether something has changed or not.